Okay, we're going to get going. So, as I said, Alex Bartholomew, CEO, People Stretch Solutions. People Stretch is a management consulting firm based in the Washington, D.C. area. Our focus is helping companies realize their potential growth by supporting strategy, OKRs, leadership development, and sales effectiveness. Joining me is my colleague, Matt Pinkham. Matt, do a quick intro for our crowd.
Hi, I'm Matt Pinkham. I'm the founder of Objective Solutions, a management consulting firm. Excited to be working with Alex and the team at People Stretch Solutions.
Okay, great, wonderful. So Matt and I are going to try to delve into the concept of cross-departmental alignment and the challenge that people face when they try to collaborate across departments. And in a lot of organizations, this is also known as dealing with silos. And one of the things that our producer, can't do a webinar without a producer, Truett Dill, is helping us today. I believe we have a poll question for our audience just to understand what is the level of pain when it comes to cross-departmental collaboration silos. So if you can go ahead and give us a sense of how big of an issue this is, that would be great. We oftentimes see a lot of people who are either interested in OKRs or the reason they adopted OKRs is because how it helps with this challenge. And so as we move into our program, we organize some great factoids for you. And the factoids first start with, when people don't collaborate, a firm as prestigious as Deloitte has shared that the cost is over $125,000 per year when people don't collaborate. And for enterprise companies, that goes up pretty dramatically. And so what we've seen, and certainly through the pandemic, I know people are tired of talking about this. Okay, great feedback on terms how much of an issue that we have for cross-departmental collaboration. So companies are challenged through the pandemic, and we've seen that communication has certainly suffered. Now, this 2020 information captures some data from the pandemic, but it was also data pre-pandemic. So even when there wasn't a pandemic, people didn't think their organization communicated well. And so that's a big contributor that naturally, the larger you become as an organization, communication suffers. And then ultimately, while working remotely, which is where we've all been for the most part over the last 18 months, these dynamics of collaboration and communication, the reality, loneliness and the impact that that has, and obviously not being able to unplug. So all of these are very real. In particular, this dynamic of, to me, collaboration and communication. What's not so obvious is the loneliness of working remote. And those two things, I think, really take a serious toll on teams not necessarily using OKRs. So today's program is to educate you a little bit about OKRs and then ultimately talk about how they help when it comes to cross-departmental collaboration. So quick history lesson on OKRs. The person who invented them is Andy Grove of Intel. He did so in the 80s and 90s. He had some record growth. Enterprise value increased roughly from 3 billion to 97 billion for Intel while he was there. And so he gets credit for inventing OKRs. And he did that out of management by objectives, or MBOs. And the biggest reason he did that is he felt like the MBOs just weren't motivating people. They lacked a sense of purpose. And his goal was to have his leaders inspire the teams. And so what he asked his leaders and downward to do is every quarter to write objectives that needed to be significant, and certainly drove some inspiration. And obviously in the beginning, that was very painful for a lot of them. But through quarterly practice, they got better and better. Now, what's important is you can't have a good objective without having a good key result. And in this case, this is very meant to be very specific, outcome oriented. But what Grove was a huge fan of is that he wanted them to be aggressive yet realistic. And that might sound like an oxymoron, but what it's meant to really drive is for people to get out of their comfort zone. And so oftentimes, and this comfort zone is exactly the issue is at hand with cross-departmental collaboration. People are used to only operating in their little silo. And when they actually have to get out of their silo, it's uncomfortable. So an organization that doesn't practice discomfort routinely, well, they're going to have some challenges. And so some of you might be wondering, well, how did OKRs grow to where they are today? Well, huge credit goes to a man by the name of John Doerr. He worked for Andy Grove at Intel, but his future was not meant to be at the processor giant. It was meant to be in venture capital. And one of John Doerr's early deals when he joined Kleiner Perkins was a company by the name of Google. And clearly a household name at this point, but nobody knew them in the late 90s when John taught Sergey Brin and Larry Page OKRs. And in John Doerr's New York Times bestseller in 2017, Larry Page talked about the credit he gave John for teaching them, because they didn't have a system for setting goals. They didn't have a way of holding their engineers accountable. And so even though they were a small company then, they adopted the framework and the rest is history. There's an important story that gets told a lot, but the cross-departmental collaboration aspect of the story is often overlooked. And so the story goes, Google back in 2008 was trying to create the best browser, okay? And back then, and this is for extra credit from our participants, hopefully someone can take a guess at what was the #1 browser back in 2008. Please drop it into chat with your guesses. I definitely get extra credit if you get it right. So back then, there was a 800-pound gorilla, and Google wanted to go after that 800-pound gorilla. Do we have any guesses, Truett? Okay, no guesses. Generally, we get a few guesses. The correct answer was Internet Explorer from Microsoft. Let's see. Oh, it was Firefox. I'm sorry, Sarah. Thank you for trying. Firefox and Netscape duked it out for organic downloads, but because Microsoft bundled everything, they got themselves in a little trouble with the antitrust department, but they were the most widely distributed browser at the time. Google wanted to best them. And so they set some ambitious key results relative to what they were trying to accomplish. And you might notice that over the course of 3 years, they increased the key results. And after the second year, they fell short. And in the third year, and this is kind of the punchline of the story that people like telling, they finally exceeded everyone and became the #1 browser. Now, what's maybe lost in this story that a lot of people don't tell is that Sundar Pichai, who was the product manager / owner at the time, and now is the current CEO, back then, he had to collaborate and work with sales, with marketing, with product ownership and management, and engineering. So no less than 5 different departments every quarter trying to synchronize their efforts. And so from what I've been told and what I've read online, Sundar credits the OKR framework of being able to get just disparate groups of teams to come back and have a regular cadence to work on this big objective, which was to build the best browser. So I know it's easy to dismiss a story because it's Google. It could never happen at your company. But what we've seen is that, #1, if you allow a talented leader to work and focus on something, it's critical for that person to see what they can accomplish. And second, there are frameworks, and OKR is one of them, that helps a company, regardless of your size, to be able to collaborate across different departments, whether they're lines of businesses, a line of business and a support department. So it's a framework that's geared to that. So let's dig in a little bit into the framework. So it's made up of 3 parts: strategic planning, execution, and retrospective. The strategic planning is meant to happen in a couple of weeks. And I know a lot of different companies have different meanings for strategic planning. What we define in OKR cycle as strategic planning is the process in which, let's look at, OKRs get introduced and they are actually communicated downward in the organization and then communicated back upward. And so in a period of 2 weeks, the hope is that we can actually get some great feedback, spark a lot of conversation, and ultimately involve more people in the strategic direction of the company. Now, it's not everyone coming to the same meeting. This happens across a 2-week and in some cases 3-week period, and this takes practice in order to engineer. But the power and the benefit is that through those conversations, which we'll get into in a moment, you're able to really understand what dependencies, where they are, who's responsible, and being able to catch that early is critical. So if we go back to the OKR cycle, we've got execution. And execution is when and where people live OKRs. And we'll talk about the key levers that leaders can pull in order to help with communication around cross-departmental initiatives. And it's this communication and collaboration that will help our listeners today, if they have these issues, really break down silos and improve or reduce friction, improve effectiveness with those initiatives. And then what's critical, and one of the sections that Matt and I oftentimes see overlooked when companies adopt OKRs without a service partner, is they skip the retrospective. And the retrospective is a workshop meeting where leaders at different levels will get together and really look back on the entire quarter. And it's meant for them to learn from the wins and really learn from where they fell short. And a lot of organizations really don't dig into why cross-departmental initiatives fell short in this period. And we're going to talk a little bit more about how you can do that better and differently, whether you want to work in OKRs or not. So this is the OKR cycle. Now, think about OKRs across the entire year. Matt and I always get questions, how does this work? And so, Matt, in your experience, where did you start seeing some cross-departmental conflicts in kind of the annual business cycle?
Yeah, I mean, it rears its head almost every year when you do annual planning. So that's the first place that you start to see these friction points is when you're setting your budget for the coming year and you've got to figure out what does my team have to accomplish this year to achieve the overall goals of the organization. And during that time, you're trying to figure out the answers to those questions while trying to secure budget for what you want to do. And everybody else in the organization is doing the same thing. So this is the first place where you start to see a lot of that friction and tension. And some organizations are good at having those conversations and many are not.
Yeah, and I think one of the challenges is everyone's focused on grabbing the money. That's a horrible expression, but everyone wants to get their funding, and teams don't start thinking about, wait a second, if we get funding, how will we pull this off? Now, we had a client that we worked with for many years, and this anecdote highlights my experience of the tension, for example, between, in the enterprise world, IT and how they have to support lines of businesses. In particular, this client was a Salesforce integrator, and routinely they were the referee between IT, and the line of business. And in a lot of cases, they didn't really have access to take the client through a process in order to organize or maybe deconflict some of these challenges that you talked about. So, important learning lesson, whether you do OKRs or not, in your annual business budget planning cycle, which normally happens if you're on a calendar fiscal right around now, going through the end of the year, it's important to start not just thinking about the what and how much, but also when and how. And oftentimes that level of detail isn't factored into a business case. So, important tidbit from everyone to take away: how can you start thinking about the relationship to get into that level of detail as you're working through? Because at some point that planning has to be present, and we recommend that it happen concurrent through that budget review, budget planning period. So also, this gives you a picture, and this deck will be available for our participants joining us today in the webinar. You can see what a full year in OKRs looks like. So as we get into strategic planning, what's really critical, and Matt and I run into this quite a bit, executive leadership has to play the air traffic control role when it comes to cross-departmental initiatives. Once again, you can take OKRs out of it. OKR makes it very explicit that they have to. And so it's not just the CEO's job or the COO's job, it's the entire executive team's job to really work at managing collectively as a team on those cross-departmental OKRs and really trying to resolve resource conflicts and constraints routinely. So I think, to me, that's an important item and a benefit that you get in OKRs every quarter, that this conversation is happening for at least 2 weeks of the quarter. Now, what happens is, as the conversation goes down, it comes back up in cross-departmental initiatives. We need to make sure there's tighter alignment up and down, but horizontally. That horizontal alignment and dependencies has to be called out. As we delve in to level 3, these teams might be contributing. And so hopefully an organization engaged in meetings, workshops, engaged in some coaching, engaged in additional offline meetings, just so everyone can be clear at the outset of the quarter or the year what level of choreography is needed to make this work. And we routinely see companies fall short on this front. Matt, I know you have a very good story for us to bring this to light as it relates to product management and engineering in a SaaS company. Will you tell our listeners kind of the story you told me?
Sure, yeah. So this is a very common story. We've worked with a number of customers that have run into this sort of issue. So this particular company was struggling with product management, having some general ideas of what needed to be done, and the engineering team having a lot of constraints on resources to get those priorities accomplished. And at the same time, those priorities were changing significantly throughout the year. And so the leadership of the organization was getting frustrated that progress wasn't being made. There wasn't enough to show at the end of every quarter or every cycle to demonstrate results. And so, the OKRs played a really critical piece to how they broke through that barrier. One of the things we worked with them on was figuring out how to get the product team to focus on outcomes that the product was trying to achieve for their customers. Looking at through OKRs through that outcome-based lens was an important way for the engineering team to understand what the best technology was to build to solve for those problems. That only happened through lots of collaboration during those planning cycles. And then on the other side, the engineering team was frustrated because a lot of the work that needed to be done in order to enable faster development and faster delivery to customers of those features, that work wasn't getting prioritized, and there wasn't an understanding of how those two things needed to be balanced. So through some of those OKR planning conversations where the team got together and really collaborated, really listened and understood where the roadblocks were and where the challenges were, when they came together, they were able to break through some of those barriers. And they were an agile shop, so they were doing agile software delivery, and OKRs became a way to accelerate all of their agile software engineering and streamline the outputs.
Yeah, that was a big win, just to be able to get these teams just more tightly aligned. And so through strategic planning, through the meetings that Matt described, a company engaging in OKRs should be able to, at least at the very beginning of the quarter or the year, really get organized. And sometimes it does require more conversations. A story that I brought, it comes from the world of sales and marketing. And so in another tech-centric company, marketing was really concerned at how sales was ramping up its new salespeople, the account executive, the inside salespeople. And so this marketing leader was concerned because if sales wasn't successful in ramping them up, then they were not going to make their revenue number. If marketing can create the lead, but if sales can't close it, that's a big problem. And so in the strategic planning, first, there was a discussion at the executive team level with the CMO and the CRO. And they shared these challenges that, hey, we're all on the same team. And what does the CRO need to really help ramp up his team effectively? Now, what this precipitated was a long list of asks, and that those asks exceeded the CMO's capacity. Now, what was really good, because this was not the first quarter they were doing OKRs, they said, hey, you know what? Let's meet down at the department level, not at the exec level. Let's bring more people to this and let's figure this out. And so in that next meeting, the CRO got the VP of sales, the inside sales manager, the CMO got, content managers, marketing ops managers, and they all got together. And through the course of, it took more than one workshop, they were able to shrink the scope. They were able to identify the highest value things they could do. And ultimately, when they got to finalizing OKRs, both teams felt like, hey, we were successful. And so anytime an organization then can do that planning and successfully ramp up eight SDRs and AEs combined in a quarter, that's a big win. Okay, we know a lot of organizations are doing a lot of hiring, and ramping up people requires more than just HR, more than just the hiring manager. So we've got to work together. Very important. So in looking at, you finalized your OKRs and you're working within them, two important levers that leader or leaders, once a cross-departmental initiative OKRs are in flight, how are they using, the one-on-ones and team reviews to bring light to where the initiative is, how key results are doing, how are we doing managing the dependencies? And so that's an important dynamic that I think is critical that OKR forces you to do. Companies by and large, especially in COVID, defaulted to the minimum. We saw one-on-ones go from weekly to bi-weekly. We saw team meetings in some cases go from weekly or bi-weekly to once a month. So knowing that we're coming back to work, hopefully sooner than later and in a responsible fashion, hopefully we can increase the frequency of meetings. And when we do, how can we make sure that we prioritize the discussion of these cross-departmental initiatives? And so that requires change. And one of the ways to be able to do that is you have to track those cross-departmental initiatives. I'm going to give you a great story from one of our service-based clients. And in the second quarter, they had a dramatically ambitious hiring goal. And so what was critical is that hiring goal, it wasn't just a function of HR. The hiring goal was at the company level, but it was HR because HR had the recruiters. But the hiring managers operated in 3 other departments. So those hiring managers were also on the hook. So we could all get organized at the beginning of the quarter and make sure that everyone's clear on what they have to do. But the challenge that everyone faces is once the quarter starts. So using a combination of one-on-ones and team meetings, they were able to consistently talk with the hiring managers and be able to feed information, because oftentimes it's not just a hiring manager, multiple people get involved, but the hiring manager has to do their share to support HR or the talent acquisition, whatever department is doing the recruiting. It's a partnership, and it's an important cross-departmental collaborative initiative that at this moment is one of the biggest challenges companies are facing because of the talent shortage. So we saw it in the second quarter. They got organized early. They used the right mix of one-on-ones and team reviews to surface where people were falling short. And so the consistency of review made it a huge difference, but that wouldn't have happened if the leaders didn't prioritize and they did the tracking. Something important to think about. Now, Matt, I know if we think about our friends in the political space, certainly in their ad business, they have struggled tracking some cross-departmental collaboration. In your mind, where do you think they've been successful and maybe not so successful with OKRs to get better at the cross-departmental collaboration between, one side of the house and then the ads business?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think the biggest area of improvement is aligning around the customer focus. So what are their customers' primary needs? And is the whole organization focused on those, even though departmentally they might be separated out into different groups and different teams, just having real clarity on what are we trying to achieve? What are the outcomes that we're trying to achieve for our collective customers at the end of the day? And that's so important, and regardless of the business, and in this particular business as well, how does it your customer engage with the organization as one integrated operation, not a series of disparate silos, right? And so for that organization, really working on what is going to move the needle on that customer relationship and customer success. And then each of the departments taking that high level, what are those high level objectives and key results, and figuring out what does this team do to contribute to those. And then as this discipline we've been talking about is how do you keep that engaged throughout the quarter? So it's not just we did it, we had this conversation, we put it on the shelf, or it's tucked away in somebody's brain. It becomes an active part of every team meeting, even if it's just a short amount of time. And then every one-on-one check-in that the team's having, it's, you said you were going to do this quarter. How are you progressing on that key result?
Having just sat through the retrospective recently, I think they're owning the fact that they're not getting it right during the quarter. I think people are talking at the beginning, but I think they owned it recently, that they just recognize that once the quarter starts, they're bad at this. Mm-hmm. So, it takes practice. Just because you decide to consider OKRs doesn't mean you automatically solve this, but it is a framework in which it provides you an opportunity, a platform, the structure, which I think is incredibly important in order to address these challenges that you face across departments. Now, another important dynamic that I think is critical is when you do a proper retrospective. And so we've seen companies that struggle with silos, that struggle collaborating across departments, it's easy to celebrate a win. It's not always easy to learn from a loss. And so in the OKRs, you get to practice this every quarter. And so a benefit is you learn from where things broke down as an example of the anecdote that I shared. A team recognized that while they got it right at the beginning of the quarter, rigor sagged throughout the quarter. And now it's going to be important that the follow-up question in a retrospective is, what will you do differently? So you don't have to do OKRs in order to use this tactic. It boils down to creating an environment where you do a look back, where you ask the question, what's your biggest learning lesson from falling short? And then following it up with, what are you going to do differently? While people might describe that and what they learned, it's critical as a leader to ask the question again. So someone in the retrospective or the look back can be very intentional in terms of what they're going to do differently, and that increases the chance of it actually happening. So Matt, from your perspective, having sat through so many retrospectives in Agile and in OKRs, what do you think are some keys from learning from cross-departmental losses?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think there's one of the common pitfalls is communication is two ways, and you can communicate your intent and what you need to have done, and think that the other person understands it and really is on board and supportive. And unless you really work hard at that communication to come back around so that you validate that you're actually being understood, that you're not just assuming people know what you're talking about or what your expectations are. So that's a common one, is you get to the end of the quarter and somebody says, well, I didn't hit this because this key result, because I didn't get support from another team. And there is the dumbfounded look of like, well, I didn't understand you needed that from me. And so it takes some time to practice this communication validation, that what you're saying, what you're writing down is truly understood by the other person. That's a fairly common issue. And I think one of the techniques is making sure when you're writing your objectives, you really are clear and concise about what it is that where you're headed and why it's important. It's one of the things that we really strongly emphasize when we're coaching on objectives, is not just what you're going to do, but what you're going to do and why it's important. And then in the key results, being very clear about outcomes that you're expecting to achieve that are measurable. And if you can't really clearly understand that, and the people around you can't clearly understand it, you've got more work to do. Because often I see that a lot, especially when people are starting with OKRs. You get to the end of the quarter and somebody says, well, I didn't really understand what it was you needed me to do or what that success looks like.
Yeah, that's always, and then people are like, I thought we talked about it.
Yeah.
So one of the things to add to Matt's story is that, and oftentimes, without getting into the weeds of OKRs gives you an opportunity to assign what a dependency is in the form of a key result. And that can stretch across departments. So everyone's contribution is very easy to track. It helps to have the right technology. We're fans of OKR software because it facilitates the tracking of these dependencies. And so in order to have that, that's critical. The other thing I want to highlight, especially to really drive learning from cross-departmental losses, is, and Google talks a lot about this. They had a Project Aristotle, and they looked at what was driving team effectiveness. And so because Google is largely responsible for OKR's proliferation, we pay a lot of attention to this project as well. And at the top of the list of the 5 most important factors is psychological safety. Now, what's good news to us is number 2, have clear goals. So that aligns to OKRs. Number 3 is having reliable teammates. Number 4 is that the work is meaningful. And number 5 is you actually understand how your work contributes to the organization. And OKRs, if you remember the cascading, that process of aligning down and up, that really helps someone at the bottom, at the front line, at the bottom of the chain, understand how they're actually contributing to the success at the top. And so those dynamics for team success are important. And when we talk about psychological safety, and because so much gets talked about it, it hinges on, Matt, what you said, communication, but it also hinges on being able to listen. Is leadership listening? Is everyone on the team listening? So this two-way dynamic is, yes, are we communicating outward, but are we listening and making sure we communicate inward? So as leaders, are we doing a good job of making sure that that's present? Because if you don't make sure that's present outside of the retrospective, you won't necessarily get the best possible retrospective. So good tidbit. We'll send it out. When we send out a copy of our slides, check out Project Aristotle. So real quick, for our guests, we've reached the time to talk about Q&A on cross-departmental alignment and how OKRs can help. Truett, do we have any questions from the group?
Yeah, we got a couple actually. So the first one is, should we start with cross-departmental OKRs?
That is a great question. And the answer is, please do not. In order to be successful on cross-departmental initiatives, an organization first needs to understand OKRs. So that is kind of basic, hey, let's understand the OKRs. And it's possible in the first quarter of doing OKRs, an organization might consider doing a prototype or a practice cross-departmental OKR. Once a team and multiple levels of the company are well-versed in OKRs, they can start bringing in the cross-departmental dynamic. But it's not good to start with it kind of in a shotgun fashion. Hey, let's all try it. Nope. Let's make sure we learn OKRs, and let's make sure if we want to practice, let's practice one cross-departmental initiative. Matt, anything to add on advice on that front?
Yeah, I think that's right. At the top level, corporate OKRs are going to require organizational collaboration. So at some level, you're going to have to wade into this water, but I completely agree with Alex. You don't want to start with the most complex scenario that you've got as you're learning this process. It will take time for organizations to iterate and get better at OKRs. But just know that, one of the things at a top level, anything you do at that top level is going to require different parts of the organization to work together to solve those problems.
Okay, great. True, you said there was another question.
Yeah, so you all already kind of answered the first part of this question, but what's the best way to include cross-departmental objectives? How do you determine ownership?
So let's go back in the process. This is because we get asked this question a lot. So when an organization sets the top level OKRs, and so here there's top level OKRs generally applied, hopefully, to most departments. Now, where cross-departmental OKRs should live is at the next level. So there are L2 OKRs that are very department specific, and there are no dependencies. And then there are L2 cross-departmental objectives that have many dependencies from other departments, support kind of horizontal departments. So that's an important dynamic that in the strategic planning phase, there's a specific meeting that should happen after the L1, which is the L2 or department level planning. And in that meeting, that's the timing when these initiatives, objectives need to be worked out and the dependencies need to be flagged. So there's time just in the story that I shared and Matt shared, like it took almost 2 weeks to work through the details of the cross-departmental collaboration we described. So it wasn't a one meeting and done. It was multiple meetings, probably sidebar conversations. But the point is, as you dive into a quarterly cycle in strategic planning, the goal is to flag it early. And by the time you finalize OKRs, everyone's clear on what the dependencies are. Matt, anything to add from what we've seen over the last couple quarters?
It's all boils down to, so much of this boils down to communication. That's really the core of this thing is, and it's one of the biggest values of doing OKRs is the framework is effective at increasing communication. And if you don't increase your communication, the framework isn't going to serve you well.
And it's increasing communication across multiple levels and horizontally. Let's be very clear, because what we see when we talk to a lot of companies is that teams are communicating. Otherwise, they wouldn't be growing. Generally, companies that engage us are companies that are actually growing, are making progress, but they want to do better and they think OKRs can help them. And so this is an important dynamic that we call out, is being able to communicate across multiple levels and then horizontally. So I think that's a dramatically important factor as we look at driving better cross-departmental collaboration across different teams. So Truett, any left before we wrap things up?
Nope, that is it.
Awesome. Well, I really appreciate, Matt, you joining us today, and I want to thank everyone. We will have, if you would like a copy of our deck, just email us, or you will get a link to put in a request and we'll get you copies of our deck. And if you'd like to answer have any additional questions, don't hesitate to ask. Thank everyone. Have a happy Wednesday. And thank you, Matt and Truett. Take care.
Thanks, Alex.
Wow.